Dust coated the floorboards of the mercantile, settling like a quiet judgment over Sadie's life. They told her a sharp tongue and a scarred jaw meant a lonely grave. She believed them. Then a heavy man, smelling of pine pitch and raw winter, kicked her door open. Motes of flour danced in the shafts of afternoon light, piercing the cracked front window of the mercantile. Sadie stood behind the scarred oak counter, her hands buried in a sack of dried pinto beans, letting the hard, pebble-like legumes slip through her fingers. The sound was a dry rattle, empty and repetitive. It was Tuesday. Tuesdays were for inventory, for counting things that didn't matter to avoid thinking about the things that did. She wiped her palms on her canvas apron, leaving a streak of gray dust. At 31, Sadie was a fixture of the town, much like the hitching post outside her door, useful, weathered, and entirely ignored unless someone needed something to lean on. A harsh childhood fever had left the left side of her jaw tight and slightly pulled, a puckered landscape of pale skin that gave her a permanent, sneering expression. The town of Oakhaven didn't forgive a woman for lacking softness. "You've a face made for ledgers, not for loving, Sadie," Reverend Cole had told her once, offering it as a compliment to her bookkeeping. She remembered the way the other girls her age had giggled behind lace fans, practicing flirtations while Sadie unloaded crates of iron nails. She hadn't minded the work. The heavy, sharp scent of oiled metal and raw wood was infinitely better than the cloying rosewater the town wives drenched themselves in. But the isolation was a physical weight, settling in her chest like a swallowed stone. No man wanted a wife who could heft a 50-pound sack of grain and look him dead in the eye without blinking. They wanted pliable. They wanted pretty. The brass bell above the door violently clanged, ripping her from the quiet arithmetic of her loneliness. The man who filled the doorway didn't just enter the shop, he eclipsed the daylight. He had to duck to clear the frame, his shoulders brushing both sides. Sadie froze, her hands still hovering over the pinto beans. The immediate assault on her senses was absolute. The shop, previously smelling of stale cinnamon and dry goods, was instantly overwhelmed by the sharp, metallic tang of cold air, old wood smoke, and the unmistakable, feral scent of unwashed wool and animal musk. He didn't swagger like the cowboys who rode into town flush with pay. He moved with a heavy, deliberate silence, the soft scuff of his hide moccasins, the only sound against the floorboards. His coat was patched together from deer hide and what looked like a bear pelt, frayed at the edges and stained dark with old blood and dirt. Beneath a wide-brimmed, grease-stained hat, his hair was a tangled mess of dark brown, merging into a thick, untamed beard. Sadie didn't reach for the shotgun she kept beneath the counter. Something about his posture stopped her. He stood in the center of the room, completely still, his eyes darting across the shelves with the wariness of a stray dog cornered in an alley. "Help you?" Sadie's voice cracked. She cleared her throat, hating the weakness in it. "Can I help you?" The man turned his head. His eyes were not the warm brown or striking blue of a romantic hero. They were the color of wet slate, pale and startlingly intense against the weathered leather of his face. He stared at her, not at the scarred side of her jaw, nor at her flour-dusted chest. He looked dead into her eyes, an unblinking assessment that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Need salt," he rasped. His voice sounded like two dry branches rubbing together in the wind. It was a voice unused to conversation. "Coffee. Lead." Sadie nodded, her pragmatism overriding her sudden strange panic. She stepped out from behind the counter, keeping a wide berth. As she passed him, she caught another scent, something beneath the grime, crushed pine needles, rain on hot stone. It was a clean smell, buried under months of isolation. "Salt is a penny a pound. Arbuckle's coffee is 50 cents a bag," she said, her tone slipping into the familiar, safe rhythm of commerce. She moved to the barrels at the back. "You need loose lead for casting, or pre-made balls?" "Loose." He followed her. She could feel the heat radiating off his massive frame. It was unsettling. Men usually gave her a wide berth, repelled by her severe demeanor. This man simply stood exactly where he needed to be, unbothered by social spacing. She scooped the coarse gray salt into a brown paper sack, Her hands shook, just a fraction. A few grains spilled over the edge, pattering against the floor. She cursed silently. "Cold out there?" she asked, not out of politeness, but because the silence was deafening. "Snow's heavy in the pass," he said. He reached out and touched a display of red woolen blankets. His hand was enormous, the knuckles thick and scarred, the fingernails chipped and black with dirt. Yet, his touch on the wool was surprisingly gentle, a tentative stroke, as if he were petting a sleeping animal. $5 for the blanket, Sadie said, setting the salt on the counter and moving to the coffee. He pulled his hand back quickly, shoving it into his deep coat pocket. Just the salt, coffee, lead. When she totaled the goods, he withdrew a small leather pouch. He didn't have coins. He pulled out 2 small, irregularly shaped pieces of dull gold, placer gold. He set them on the wood. Sadie pulled her brass scale forward. The metal clinked as she weighed the nuggets. "This is worth more than your supplies," she told him. "I owe you about $3 in change." He stared at the small pile of supplies. "Keep it. Hold an account. I don't even know your name, mister." "Boone." "Just Boone?" "Just Boone." He gathered the sacks in one massive arm, treating them as if they weighed nothing. He looked at her one last time. Again, the slate-gray eyes pinned her in place. There was no pity in them, no disgust, just a flat, honest acknowledgement of her existence. "Obliged," he muttered. Then he turned and walked out. The bell jingled a frantic farewell. The cold draft lingered, swirling the dust on the floor, but the overpowering scent of the wild remained in her shop for hours. Sadie found herself standing behind the counter, staring at the brass scale long after the sun began to set, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. It took 3 weeks for the scent of wood smoke and pine pitch to finally fade from Sadie's memory, and precisely that long for Boone to return. The winter had deepened, locking Oak Haven in a brutal grip of frost and howling wind. The townspeople scurried from doorway to doorway like frightened mice, wrapped in thick wool, heads down. Sadie kept the iron stove in the center of the mercantile, burning cherry red, the smell of hot iron and burning hickory, providing a small comfort against the drafts that rattled the window panes. She was in the middle of restacking a pyramid of tinned peaches when the door blew open. A flurry of white snow invaded the shop, swirling around the massive silhouette in the doorway. Sadie didn't drop the tin she was holding, but her grip tightened until her knuckles went white. Boone stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind him with a heavy, snow-caked boot. He looked worse than before. His beard was frosted with ice, his lips cracked and bleeding, and a dark, fresh stain marred the shoulder of his hide coat. He didn't speak. He just walked straight toward the stove, pulling off his heavy leather mittens with his teeth. He held his hands out to the radiant heat. They were red, raw, and trembling slightly. Sadie set the tin down. She didn't rush over with frantic motherly concern. She didn't gasp at the blood. She picked up a clean rag from beneath the counter and walked over to the stove. "You're bleeding on my floor," she said, her voice flat, masking the sudden, erratic thumping in her chest. Boone looked down at his shoulder, then back at the stove. "Cougar," he grunted. "Surprised me on the ridge. I surprised him more. Looks like he got a fair piece of you first." Sadie stepped closer. The smell of him was stronger this time, compounded by the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood and the sour stench of exhausted sweat. "Take the coat off before you bleed out on my good pine boards. I'll fetch some hot water and carbolic." Boone eyed her warily. He wasn't used to taking orders. That much was clear in the rigid set of his jaw. But the exhaustion in his posture won out. With a wince that he quickly hid, he shrugged out of the heavy coat. Underneath, he wore a rough-spun linen shirt, glued to his left shoulder by a thick, dark crust. Sadie retreated to the back room, her hands moving mechanically. She poured water from the kettle into an enamel basin, grabbed the bottle of carbolic acid, and tore a strip of clean white cotton. Why she was doing this, she didn't know. The town doctor was 3 doors down. But sending him back out into the freezing wind felt like a betrayal of the quiet understanding they had somehow established. When she returned, Boone was sitting on a wooden crate near the stove, his head resting in his hands. He looked up as she approached. "I'm going to have to peel the shirt back," Sadie said. setting the basin on a nearby barrel. "It'll hurt." "Done worse myself," he murmured. Sadie stepped into his personal space. Up close, he was a mountain of solid muscle and thick bone. She could feel the heat of him, smell the damp wool and the raw scent of a man who lived entirely outside the boundaries of polite society. She reached out, her fingers brushing the warm skin of his neck as she grasped the collar of his shirt. Her breath hitched. It was the first time she had touched a man in anything but commerce in over a decade. His skin was rough, weathered like old leather, but surprisingly warm. She pulled the fabric away from the wound. Boone hissed through his teeth, his muscles seizing, but he didn't pull away. The claw marks were deep, 4 jagged lines tearing across the heavy muscle of his shoulder. "Needs stitching," she said, her voice dropping to a low murmur. "Got a needle?" "I'm a shopkeeper, Boone. I have plenty of needles. But I'm not a seamstress. Flesh is flesh." Sadie soaked the rag in the hot, chemical-smelling water and began to clean the congealed blood. She scrubbed harder than was perhaps necessary, a strange, nervous energy possessing her. Boone didn't flinch. He just watched her. He watched the tight, puckered skin on her jaw, the severe line of her mouth, the focused intensity in her eyes. "They tell you it makes you ugly?" he asked suddenly. The sound of his rough voice in the quiet shop made her jump. She stopped swabbing the wound. Her face grew hot, a flush of anger and shame creeping up her neck. "Excuse me?" "The scar," he said, gesturing with a bloody hand toward her face. "People in town, they look at you like a broke-legged horse. Figured they told you it makes you ugly." Sadie's jaw tightened. "They don't have to tell me. Mirrors work just fine." "Mirrors lie," Boone stated simply. "Mirrors only show the surface." "And what do you see from up on your mountain?" Sadie snapped, pressing the carbolic-soaked rag firmly into his wound. Boone gritted his teeth, a low groan vibrating in his chest, but his eyes never left hers. "I see a woman who didn't scream when a bloody man walked into her shop. I see hands that don't shake. You survive." He looked away, staring into the glowing belly of the iron stove. "Pretty don't survive the winter. Strong does." Sadie stood frozen, the bloody rag dripping into the basin. Nobody had ever called her strong as if it were a virtue. It was always a condemnation, too strong, too hard, too masculine. From him, it sounded like a reverence. She turned away to thread the needle, needing a moment to hide the sudden, stinging wetness in her eyes. "You talk too much for a hermit," she muttered, her voice thick. "Only when there's something worth saying." She returned with the needle and thick black thread. "This is going to sting," she warned. "Get on with it." As she pushed the needle through his tough skin, pulling the jagged edges of the wound together, the silence in the room changed. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of her lonely days. It was a shared silence, an agreement. She felt the heavy rise and fall of his chest with every breath, felt the subtle flinch of his muscles under her hands, and realized, with a terrifying jolt, that the stone in her chest had cracked open. Just a fraction. Mud replaced the snow, thick and greedy. It clung to wagon wheels and sucked at the soles of boots, dragging the grime of the street right onto Sadie's clean floorboards. Spring in Oakhaven was not a delicate awakening. It was an ugly, wet struggle against the thaw. The mercantile smelled of damp wool, wet dog, and the sour scent of unwashed men shedding their winter layers. Sadie leaned heavily against the counter, a broom gripped tightly in her calloused hands. Her back ached from sweeping the heavy clumps of dirt back out the front door. 3 months had passed since she stitched the torn flesh of Boone's shoulder. He had vanished back into the timberline the very next morning, leaving behind a stack of chopped firewood by her back door, and an unsettled feeling in her gut that she could not scrub away. She convinced herself he was dead. The winter had been too bitter, his wound too deep. It was a cynical comfort, easier to accept than the possibility that he simply hadn't wanted to return. The floorboards of the porch creaked. It was a heavy, deliberate pressure, different from the hurried steps of the townsfolk dodging the rain. Sadie stopped sweeping. She recognized the rhythm. Boone pushed the door open. He didn't look dead. He looked like the mountain itself had walked into her shop. He was leaner, the angles of his face sharper beneath the wild beard. but the sheer, intimidating mass of him remained unchanged. He wore a canvas coat slick with rain, and over his shoulder he carried a heavy burlap sack. The feral scent of hemp pine resin, wet earth, and raw wilderness instantly overpowered the stale air of the room. He didn't offer a greeting. He walked to the counter and dropped the sack. The heavy thud rattled the glass jars of peppermint sticks. "Muck's deep," he said. His voice was a low, rusty scrape. Sadie's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she forced her jaw to lock, presenting him with the scarred, rigid side of her face. "You track that mud past the doorway. I'll make you scrub it on your knees," she snapped, pointing the broom handle at his boots. Boone looked down at his feet, then back up at her. A muscle twitched near his eye. It might have been amusement. He carefully wiped his boots on the rough sisal mat, taking an agonizingly long time before stepping fully into the shop. "Brought to trade," he said, gesturing to the sack. Sadie moved behind the counter, keeping the wooden barrier between them. She untied the rough twine. Inside were 3 beaver pelts, thick and dark, cured with an expert hand. Beneath them lay a small, heavy jar sealed with wax. She pulled it out. It was filled with pale, golden honey, comb and all. "Pelts for flour, coffee, and salt," Boone said. He pointed a thick, dirt-stained finger at the jar. "That's for the mending." Sadie stared at the honey. It caught the dull gray light from the window, glowing like trapped amber. No one brought her gifts. People paid what they owed, to the penny, and left. She swallowed hard, the tightness in her throat returning. "The stitching was 3 months ago. I considered the account settled. I didn't." Before Sadie could formulate a response that wouldn't betray the sudden foolish trembling in her hands, the shop bell shrieked. Mrs. Gable bustled in, shaking a wet umbrella. The mayor's wife was a woman constructed entirely of starch and judgment. She stopped dead in her tracks, her pinched nose wrinkling as she caught the scent of the wild man standing at the counter. She pulled her expensive broadcloth shawl tighter around her shoulders, giving Boone a wide theatrical berth as she approached Sadie. "Sadie, dear," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, while her eyes darted nervously to Boone. "I need 2 pounds of sugar and a spool of white thread. Make it quick. The smell in here is quite overpowering today." Sadie felt her spine go rigid. A familiar hot shame crawled up her neck. She reached beneath the counter for the sugar scoop. 50 cents, Mrs. Gable. Boone didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his slate-gray eyes fixing on the mayor's wife. He didn't scowl. He simply observed her the way a predator observes a particularly loud, irritating bird. The silence he projected was heavy, suffocating the ambient noise of the rain outside. Mrs. Gable shifted uncomfortably, the change jingling in her gloved hand. "Really, Sadie, you ought to be more careful about the sort of vagrants you allow in here. A woman alone, with your condition, one can't be too careful. They bring diseases down from those hills." Sadie's hand tightened around the tin scoop until the metal bit into her palm. She opened her mouth to tell Mrs. Gable to take her coins and leave, but Boone spoke first. "Ma'am," Boone drawled, his voice rumbling low in his chest. "You smell like a dead whale dipped in flower water. It's giving me a headache." Mrs. Gable gasped, a sharp, reedy sound of absolute scandal. Her face turned a violent shade of plum. "How dare you? Sadie, are you going to allow this animal to speak to me this way?" "He's a paying customer, Martha," Sadie said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "And he's right. You wear too much ambergris perfume. It taints the flour. Your sugar is on the counter. Take it and go." The older woman snatched her parcels, threw the coins onto the wood, and practically ran for the door, the bell violently clanging in her wake. Sadie stared at the scattered coins. The adrenaline left her in a rush, leaving her knees weak. She had just insulted the mayor's wife. Half the town's wives would boycott her shop by tomorrow. She pressed her hands against her eyes, letting out a ragged breath. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. "She was talking down to you. I am used to it. It's my life, Boone. Now I'll lose business. If they only buy from you so they can spit on you, it ain't business. It's a toll. Boone leaned his massive forearms on the counter. You sell your pride too cheap, Sadie. She dropped her hands, furious. You don't know anything about my pride. You live in the woods. You don't have to survive these people. I do. This shop is all I have. You have hands. You have a spine. He reached across the counter. His large, rough hand covered hers where it rested on the wood. The heat of his skin seared through her cold fingers. You don't need 'em, Sadie. You just think you do. She tried to pull her hand away, but his grip, while gentle, was immovable. She looked up at him, her chest heaving, the cynical armor she wore every day cracking straight down the middle. He wasn't looking at her scar. He was looking at her, and for the first time in her life, Sadie didn't want to hide. Thunder hit the valley like a dropped anvil. The glass of the mercantile window shivered in its frame, a high-pitched rattle that set Sadie's teeth on edge. The spring storm had rolled over the jagged peaks just past noon, turning the sky the color of a bruised plum. Now, it was unleashing a torrential fury that Oakhaven hadn't seen in a decade. The street outside was a churning river of brown slurry, carrying away discarded crates and loose hitching posts. Inside the shop, the air was thick, smelling heavily of damp wood, ozone, and wet burlap. The iron stove sat cold in the center of the room. Lighting a fire with the wind howling down the chimney flue was a fool's errand. Sadie stood on a wobbly pine chair, a rusty tin bucket clutched in her hands, desperately trying to catch the water weeping through a fresh crack in the ceiling directly over her dry goods. Cold water dripped onto her forehead, running down her nose and mixing with the sweat of panic. If the flour and sugar got wet, she was ruined. The mercantile ran on razor-thin margins, and a lost inventory meant a winter of starvation. Need to move the barrels. Boone's voice came from the shadows near the back wall. He had stayed after the incident with Mrs. Gable, lingering silently while the storm gathered strength. Now, he stepped into the dim, gray light, shedding his heavy canvas coat. Underneath, his linen shirt was already damp with sweat. They weigh 200 pounds each, Sadie yelled over a crack of thunder. She stepped down from the chair, wiping her wet face with the back of her sleeve. I can't budge them, and you can't lift them alone. Boone didn't argue. He walked to the first flour barrel, gripped the thick oak rim with hands like iron vises, and heaved. The tendons in his neck stood out like thick cords. The barrel tilted, the wood groaning in protest. He rolled it on its bottom edge, walking it back toward the dry corner of the shop with a brute, stubborn strength that terrified her as much as it fascinated her. Sadie didn't stand by watching. She scrambled to grab the smaller sacks of rice and beans, hauling them away from the encroaching puddle. They worked in tandem, a silent, desperate dance in the gloom of the failing light. The physical exertion stripped away the awkwardness of the afternoon. There was only the heavy sound of their breathing, the relentless drumming of the rain, and the necessity of the labor. When the last barrel was secure, Sadie collapsed onto a wooden crate, her lungs burning. Her hair had escaped its tight, severe bun and hung in wet, straggly ropes around her face. Her canvas apron was soaked, clinging awkwardly to her frame. She looked like a drowned rat. She knew. She didn't care. The goods were safe. Boone walked over, his chest heaving, his boots leaving wet tracks on the floor. He didn't sit. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at her. In the dim light, the slate gray of his eyes was almost black. The wind suddenly shrieked, hitting the front of the shop with the force of a physical blow. The large front window, the expensive imported glass that Sadie washed every single Sunday, gave way with a sickening crack. Glass exploded inward, scattering across the floor like deadly hail. The storm rushed in immediately. Rain slashed across the counter, soaking the ledgers, and the wind began tearing at the stacked tins on the shelves. "No!" Sadie screamed, jumping to her feet. The instinct to protect her livelihood overrode her common sense. She ran toward the gaping hole, the wind immediately driving the freezing rain deep into her bones. Boone caught her by the waist before she reached the glass-strewn floor. His arm was a steel bar, unyielding. "Let me go!" She thrashed against his hold, her boots slipping on the wet floorboards. "The wind will ruin everything. Glass will cut you to ribbons," he yelled back, his voice cutting through the roar of the storm. He pulled her backward, his grip tight but careful not to bruise. "Stay back, I'll board it." He let her go and moved toward the front, grabbing 2 heavy wooden planks she used for shutters and a hammer from the counter. He stood in the teeth of the gale, the rain instantly pasting his shirt to the heavy muscle of his back. Sadie watched, shivering violently, as he